So what if hydrogen is not the beginning of matter? What if the periodic table, as it is commonly known today, does not start at its true origin that we're told, but somewhere in the middle of a much deeper process? And what if one of the greatest chemists that we know in history, Dmitri Mendeleev, greatly suggested that? Cosmic Familia, welcome back to the channel. Hope everyone's doing well in good spirit. This is going to be a long video and is only for those who are open-minded to stay to the end of the video. Don't forget to please like, comment, share, and follow if you're new for these longer videos because they don't get much reach, and I hope you guys enjoy. I don't think anybody else has really touched on this. Now, in his lesser-known work, A Chemical Conception of the Ether, Mendeleev approached a question that modern science largely abandoned. What is the chemical nature of the ether? As he writes, the earnest investigator seeking the reality of truth is forced to ask himself, what is the chemical nature of the ether? So this is not speculation. It is a demand for physical explanations of the luminiferous ether. Mendeleev was not content with treating ether as just an abstract medium. He insisted that it exists, that it absolutely is real, it's measurable and classifiable. And side note, even in the book The Subtle Medium Proved Ether, Elementary Fire, ether, according to Sir Isaac Newton, is a subtle matter, much finer and rarer than air. So sometimes termed as a subtle spirit, as in the latter end of his book, Principia, and sometimes a subtle ethereal medium, and in his book, Optics. So even Newton argued for the luminiferous ether. Now, Mendeleev goes further in describing ether in explicitly chemical terms. Quote, the ether may be said to be a gas incapable of chemical combination, a simple body, an element endowed with a high penetrating power. Here, ether is not outside of the periodic system. It is a gas-like substance, a simple body, and fundamentally an elemental form of matter. Sometimes something that does not combine, but instead pervades everything else. So it's an ultra-rarefied monoatomic gas. The highest regions of the atmosphere, which are the seat of the aurora borealis, must be considered to be the province of hydrogen and argon. This is only a few steps from the yet more distant regions of the sky, higher up there. Okay. The necessity of recognizing the existence of a still lighter gas capable of permeating and filling space and giving a tangible reality to the conception of the ether. In conceiving of the ether as a gas imbued with the above properties and belonging to the zero group of elements, as he shows in his book, I desired before all to extract from the periodic law that which it was able to give and to tangibly explain the materiality and universal presence of an ethereal substance throughout nature, and also to explain its faculty of permeating all substances, gaseous, liquid, and solid. That's on page 43 through 44. So from this foundation, Mendeleev arrives at a radical conclusion. But at the present time, when there can be no doubt that the hydrogen group is preceded by the zero group composed of elements of less atomic weights, it seems to me impossible to deny the existence of elements lighter than hydrogen. If you look at his table here, it's showing you that he anticipated elements lighter than hydrogen. This statement alone reshapes the structure of the periodic table and the periodic system. Hydrogen is not the first element. It is preceded by more fundamental substances that we do not fully comprehend because they were removed by the Rockefeller education system. They were probably working with these elements, and at some point they decided to take them out. Okay, so he even describes these as particles of ultralight elements. The particles and atoms of the lightest element capable of moving freely everywhere throughout the universe. They have an atomic weight nearly 1/1,000,000th of that of hydrogen. The atoms of even the lighter elements forming the ordinary substances being several million times heavier than those of the ether, saying that hydrogen above are millions of times more heavier than the ones that were not shown. So at this level, matter becomes extremely subtle, highly mobile, and universally present, and this begins to resemble what he elsewhere associates with the ether itself. Now, the box periodic table model was first publicly published and made popular in 1869 by Dmitri Mendeleev. But the first renderings of what we call the periodic table and the law of octaves was discovered by chemist John Newlands in 1865, and then later refined in the 1900s by Walter Russell, the spiral graph that we all know of. So the law of octaves was prior to Mendeleev, yet Mendeleev got the credit for it. And as the years progressed, many people created other versions of the spiral periodic table model. So the first spiral table as a circle was by Heinrich Baumenhauer in 1870. Walter Russell just has the best spiral graph model in my opinion, and as well as many others. So decades later, Walter Russell approached the structure of matter from an entirely different but yet similar direction. Walter Russell was a 20th century polymath whose work in the year like 1920 attempted to unify science, art, and metaphysics into a single cosmology, grounded in light as the fundamental substance of reality. His central thesis proposed that the universe is not composed of solid matter, but rather of oscillating wave fields of light. In his books, The Universal One and The Secret of Light, among others, Walter Russell argued that all creation emerges from a still undivided magnetic light, which could be the black sun, which he equated with divine intelligence. This conception parallels elements found in Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, and Hermetic philosophy, where the one emanates multiplicity through ordered vibration. Walter Russell rejected conventional atomic theory, instead proposing a wave-based cosmos governed by pressure gradients and spiral motions, frequencies. He believed that human consciousness participates directly in this cosmic process, functioning as both observer and co-creator. His ideas anticipated later discussions in quantum interpretations, though they remain outside of mainstream scientific validation. Still to this day, his synthesis continues to attract those seeking a unified metaphysical framework, bridging science and mysticism. So instead of a static table, he proposed the wave-based spiral system, a toroidal model of the periodic table. In this model, matter merges through cycles of compression and expansion. Keep that in mind for later in the video when we talk about gravity. Elements are not fixed. They are phases with the process. And once again, hydrogen is not the beginning. All of the elements are made up of very self-same spiral units of motion, or vortices. The only reason we have for thinking of the elements as different substances is because they have certain predictable effects upon each other and upon our senses. The fact of the matter is, however, that their pressure conditions are configured different in every part of the wave in which they find themselves on the spiral graph. The 92 natural atoms repeat in cycles or periods, like the notes of musical octaves. The accumulation of electrons is continuous, so the periodic table would be more accurately depicted as a continuous spiral ribbon, a widening, unfolding vortex rolling around itself like a seashell. As Mendeleev states in 1869, the series of elements is uninterrupted and corresponds to a certain degree to a spiral function, a polyhedral configuration of interlinked toroidal structures, stacked and oriented across multiple axes. These toroidal forms generate cusps through which magnetic fields accelerate particles axially, directing flow along defined vectors. It is precisely this geometry that gives rise to a spherical plasma field, plasma enveloping the structure. The superconducting toroidal magnetism emanating from this configuration acts as a containment mechanism, preventing the plasma from escaping and stabilizing as a coherent spherical form. So within the toroidal model of like the argon atom, if you could follow it all the way into the center of that atom, you would encounter a nested toroidal structure, a primary central torus, surrounded by a secondary toroidal enclosure, similar to a Prussian doll type of thing. From this core configuration, the energy structure steps outward into the first shell, and then into the second shell, and then into the third, and so on and so forth. In this sequence, neon corresponds to the first completed layer, while argon represents the second, and each layer is forming a closed, balanced toroidal shell or field that defines its noble gas stability. Extending this same geometry outward, the next noble gas, krypton, emerges as the third completed layer, and as each layer of additional toroidal shells are introduced, each nested harmonically around the inner structures, maintaining coherence through proportional spacing. And this system becomes more complex, yet remains stable because each new torus is phase aligned with the central vortex, allowing energy to circulate inward and outward without interference. Beyond krypton, xenon represents the fourth completed layer, and at this scale, the toroidal architecture expands further, incorporating additional nested fields that preserve symmetry across all directions. And despite the increased complexity, the system remains inert because of the outermost toroidal layer closes the circuit, achieving equilibrium. Each noble gas therefore marks a moment of geometric completion, where the toroidal structure resolves itself into a self-contained, non-reactive configuration before the next cycle of expansion begins. These are what we postulate as the electrons in the outer shell, essentially toroidal forms of whirling energy. Each torus is interconnected with the whole and anchored to the center, forming a continuous spiral vortex that extends inward and outward at all times simultaneously. And each of these tori operates at extreme velocity, approaching the speed of light. If you could literally jump inside of an atom, the structure resolves into what is described as a toroidal wheelworks. And from this framework emerges the 16 postulates in which proton and electron counts remain consistent with fundamental geometric patterns, while completion between layers is achieved through vector equilibrium. Defining the noble gases as inert states of the same substance along the inertial line. Between these stable configurations are intermediate steps that continue to express and propagate the entire toroidal pattern. Now, as we look at this spiral-based periodic chart, something immediately stands out. Once again, hydrogen is not the beginning. Instead, we see a sequence of pre-hydrogen states, alphanon, betanon, gammanon. At the end, you see omeganon, which we're not going to get into. But take a look here closely. Even at one of these pre-hydrogen elements is even called aethanon, all appearing before hydrogen. This directly echoes what Mendeleev suggested in his book, A Chemical Conception of the Ether, where he mentioned coronium, and he argued that elements lighter than hydrogen must exist, forming a deeper foundation beneath the periodic system than what we're taught. What Walter Russell visualizes here is not a static table, but a process, an unfolding, a progression, an unwinding. These pre-hydrogen states can be understood as transitional phases, where matter has not yet fully condensed. Hydrogen, then, is not the origin, but just the first visible threshold of material expression that we can see. And what we call elements may arise from something more subtle, an underlying medium, and whether described as ether or a structured wave state, this foundation suggests that matter is not the starting point, but the result of something deeper, unseen, and continuum. Now we begin to see this convergence. Mendeleev, working with classical chemistry, proposes ether as an element and substances lighter than hydrogen. Walter Russell, working from a wave-based perspective, presents structured stages before hydrogen, a progression into material form. Two total different systems arriving at a similar implication that matter emerges from something more fundamental. Within Mendeleev's framework, the description of these ultralight particles moving freely throughout all spaces forms the conceptual basis for what we refer to as aetherions, not as finalized theory, but as a conceptualization that ether may consist of these smaller, faster, more frequently vibrational, discrete, extremely subtle units, more fundamental in behavior than known particles. If we read in this book, Occult Ether Physics, it says similar stuff. It reads, my basic ether particle is called the omni, which has a positive nucleus called a protet, called an omnion, and a negative subelectron, an electret, called an omnitron. As you may have noticed, this scheme is a scaled down version of the basic hydrogen atom with its proton and electron. Like most atoms, the omni is normally neutral and in equilibrium, but is much smaller, being ultrafine. Due to its tiny size and neutrality, it can pass easily through solid bodies in respect to high-frequency electromagnetic radiation of specific range, from the infrared through to the visible light frequencies, which disturb its equilibrium. Yet, though we can feel it, it appears to be transparent and invisible to the naked eye. Like hydrogen gas, there is some elasticity due to the compressibility of the magnetic fields. So it is as an elastic solid, as Faraday said. Due to the tiny omni size, so-called empty space is actually packed with almost solid with this very fine matter, which oscillates at such high frequencies, well beyond that of X-rays. Yet the tiny size and normal neutrality allows it to penetrate solid mass, which is mostly space. And this brings us to an interesting observation. Within Walter Russell's system, one of the pre-hydrogen states is named aethenon, placed just before the emergence of hydrogen. Now, whether it's intentional or coincidental, it doesn't matter. The similarity between these two are actually very similar. The aetherion and aethenon is very striking. They both appear to be prior to hydrogen, associated with subtle foundational states, and positioned near the boundary between the non-material and the material. This does not confirm that they are the same, but it suggests a recurring intuition across different frameworks that matter arises from something ether-like in nature. But the atoms of ether must be of another kind. They must be capable of overcoming even the sun's attraction, of freely permeating all space, and of penetrating everything and everywhere. That's on page 30 of Mendeleev's book. Now, page 46 through 47 of A Chemical Conception of the Ether, it reads, by conceiving the substance of the ether as the lightest of gases, X, as X is the first element of his pre-hydrogen elements in his periodic table in his book, deprived like helium and argon of the power to form stable, definite compounds. It need not be imagined that this gas is deprived of the faculty of, as it were, dissolving in or accumulating about large centers of attraction. If ether is a gas, X, it must naturally accumulate from all parts of the universe towards the medium of mass or the sun, just as the gases of the atmosphere accumulate in a drop of water. And the lightest of gases, X, will also accumulate about the heaviest atoms of uranium and thorium, and perhaps change its form of motion like a gas dissolved in a liquid. If such a special accumulation of ether atoms about the molecules of uranium and thorium be admissible, they might be expected to exhibit peculiar phenomena, determined by the emission of a portion of this ether held by particles of normal mean velocity, and by new ether entering into the sphere of attraction. It seems to me that the optical and photoradiant phenomena, not to mention the loss of electrical charges, indicate a material flow of something which has not been weighed, and it appears to me that they might be understood in this matter, for peculiar forms of the entrance and egress of ether atoms should be accompanied by such disturbances in the ethereal medium as give the phenomena of light. Mendeleev is essentially here describing the ether as the lightest of gases and as a real ultralight, super rarefied monoatomic gas that can gather around massive bodies like the sun or heavier elements, much like a medium being absorbed or concentrated. What he's pointing toward is the idea that light radiation and electrical effects may actually come from the movement and exchange of the ether, something flowing in and out of matter rather than empty space interactions. Focusing more on motion and disturbances within the ether itself, suggesting that light and radiation doesn't just come from matter, but from shifts in the internal behavior of the medium surrounding it, the ether, especially near massive atoms or large bodies like the sun. When he mentions ether atoms, he could be talking about aetherons. So in conclusion, I may mention another class of phenomena which led me to this conception of the ether. Delaware, about 1894, in his researches on the phenomena proceeding at low temperatures, observed that the phosphorescence of many substances, and especially of paraffin, becomes more intense at the temperature of liquid air, between 181 and 193 degrees. Now, it appears to me that this is due to the fact that paraffin and such like substances have a great capacity for condensing the atoms of ether at very low temperatures. In other words, that the solubility, which is the absorption of the ether in some bodies, increases in extreme cold. They therefore become more phosphorescent, for the vibrations of light are then set up in the phosphorescent substances, not only by their own atoms having the property of illumination at their surface, of passing into a state of peculiar tension, which causes, when the act of illumination ceases, the ether to vibrate, but also by the atoms of ether which condense in these bodies and set up a rapid state of interchange with the surrounding medium. It seems to me that this conception of ether as a peculiar, all-permeating gas gives a means, if not of analyzing such phenomena, at all events of understanding their possibility. In reflecting on low-temperature experiences, Dmitri Mendeleev observed that certain substances exhibited intensified phosphorescence when cooled to the extremes of liquid air. Phosphorescence means it gives off light. He proposed that this effect was due to an increased capacity for these materials to absorb or condense what he referred to as the atoms of the ether. In such conditions, the ether itself appeared to become more interactive, more concentrated within matter, giving rise to heightened luminous activity. If taken seriously, this suggests that ether is not merely an abstract medium, but something that can accumulate, condense, and respond to environmental conditions, particularly the extreme cold. This becomes even more intriguing when we consider substances like paramagnetic liquid oxygen, which at similarly low temperatures exhibits unusual magnetic responsiveness and structural behavior, appearing to organize itself with surrounding fields. When viewed through a broader lens, you can consider whether such phenomena reflects a transition of this all-pervading medium into a more structured, cohesive state, approaching a crystalline or fluid-like boundary between the invisible and the visible. In this sense, the idea of ethereal particles, or what later interpretations are calling them etherons, begins to align this permeating substance capable of manifesting differently under various conditions, hinting at a continuum between energy, atmosphere, and structured form. It might be something that explains the formation of the firmament. So when we step back, a deeper pattern begins to emerge that what we call matter may not be fundamental, and that hydrogen is not the beginning. Instead, it may represent an in-between condensation point, a transition, a boundary between the visible and the invisible, a threshold emerging from something more subtle, something that thinkers across disciplines have denied and attempted to describe as the luminiferous ether. And perhaps the true origin of the periodic system remains not in what we can measure, but in what gives rise to measurement itself. The universe is operating through a self-reproducing light wave governed by an intrinsic geometric pattern that organizes energy into form. This light wave builds energetic structures, scales energy into higher potentials, and creates the appearance of separate, interacting objects. At the same time, the same underlying process can dissolve and recalibrate those forms to meet new energetic expressions. All motion is unified under this single generative principle, linked to a symphony directed by one conductor. The system functions as a totality. Any change within it affects the whole instantly, even though it appears to unfold through time. Ultimately, existence is presented as a dual process, simultaneously something and nothing, a temporary expression that allows differentiation and experience to arise within a timeless, unified field. The central premise here is that all elements are not fundamentally separate substances, but different expressions of a single underlying reality, and within the framework that we've been building, that underlying reality can be understood as the luminiferous ether itself. Not empty space, but a continuous, all-pervading medium as described by Dmitri Mendeleev, a substance capable of condensing, organizing, and giving rise to what we perceive as matter. In this sense, matter is not primary, but emergent, formed through the structuring of the ether into stable, resonant states. Each element is said to possess an intrinsic musical note or specific frequency. By interacting with the correct tone, it's claimed that matter itself can be reconfigured. From an ether-based perspective, these frequencies are not isolated properties of the atoms, but they are harmonic signatures of the ether itself, vibrational conditions that determine how the medium organizes into form. What we call elements are, in this view, standing wave patterns, stable geometries formed within a dynamic, vibrating field. Every element is proposed to correspond to a specific tone or frequency. Hydrogen, for example, is described as resonating at 40.5 hertz and sharing the same musical key of E with carbon. As elements progress through related series, their frequencies are said to double, forming harmonic relationships rather than chemically isolated identities. These relationships suggest a continuum where each element is a phase shift within the same medium rather than a completely separate substance. And this is what we see in Walter Russell's periodic table. Sound and light are described as fundamentally related through their wavelength. By repeatedly dividing the wavelength of light, corresponding audible sound frequencies can be derived. This reveals a deeper unity of sound, which is tone, light, which is color, and matter, which is form and structure, are all interconnected expressions of vibration existing at different scales within the ether. What appears separate to the senses of our eyes at a deeper level is a synchronized system of oscillations within one continuous field. This stands in contrast to the standard periodic table and aligns more closely with the circular spiral graph-based model proposed by Walter Russell. Rather than a rigid box-like structure, the elements unfold in a vortex-like pattern, suggesting motion, polarity, and continuous transformation within the ether. In this model, elements such as hydrogen, carbon, silicon, and cobalt, they all occupy positions between inert states, implying that they are not separate substances, but different compressive states of the same underlying medium. Taken even further, this framework begins to blur the boundary between atmosphere and structure. If the ether can condense under certain conditions, as suggested in low temperature experiments, then transitions from invisible medium to visible medium form may not be abrupt, but actually gradual. And this opens up the possibility that large-scale structures, even what has been described as the firmament, could represent regions where the ether becomes highly organized, approaching a crystalline or fluid-like state, where vibration, magnetism, and form all converge together. And taken together, this perspective suggests that what we call elements are not fixed building blocks, but they are harmonic conditions, resonant states of the ether itself. Matter is not the origin, but the result, a visible expression of an invisible structural medium. And in that sense, the periodic system may not be a list of substances, but a map of how the ether organizes, unfolds, resonates, and ultimately becomes the world that we experience all around us. Now, globe trolls are always going to be saying, oh, no, this has all been debunked. It doesn't exist. Gravity this, gravity that, blah, blah. But this is actually what was the battle between gravity and ether. Putting ether in the periodic table of elements would contradict the notion of gravity, of what we all understand. But this is a very important part of the video because you need to understand this. Mendeleev states on page 32 through 33, neither gravity nor any of the problems of energy can be rightly understood without a real conception of the ether as a universal medium transmitting energy at a distance. Gravity may in some way or another be explained by means of pressure or impact acting from all sides, but chemical attraction, which only acts at infinitely small distances, while long remain an incomprehensible problem. The problem of the ether is more or less closely connected with that of gravity, and gains in simplicity when all questions of the chemical attraction of the atoms of ether is excluded, and this is accomplished by placing it in the zero group. That's on page 31. In this passage, Mendeleev is separating gravity from chemical forces, suggesting that gravity may come from pressure within a surrounding medium, while ether operates beyond typical chemical interactions. By placing ether in the zero group in that table he's emphasizing that it behaves unlike ordinary matter, more like a fundamental background substance influencing forces rather than participating in them directly. Mendeleev isn't rejecting gravity outright. He's suggesting it might be explained differently than the conventional idea of an inherent pull. In those quotes, he's saying that gravity is gravitation, that it could come from pressure or impacts within a surrounding medium, the ether, acting from all directions, rather than being an invisible force acting at a distance. He is very clearly linking gravity to the ether, a medium that connects mechanical motion, physical forces, and chemical interactions into a single continuous system, that all phenomena are the same phenomena of a unification of heat, electricity, magnetism, and light within an accompanying geometry. Gravity is a focal point from which matter desires to explode. Gravity does not pull inwardly from within as the deceptive illusion of nature would have us to believe. All phenomena, according to Walter Russell, are expressions of gravitation and radiation in that simple way. G equals mv squared. That equation unifies all phenomena as it expresses something that applies to all phenomena. Mass is generated into the appearance of form by the attraction of gravitation and is radiated into the disappearance of form by the repulsion of radiation. Energy is conceived in inertia, stored in mass, and recorded in plane. Gravity can be understood as a cycle, not just a pull. Gravitation concentrates energy inward to form mass, while radiation releases it outward, dissolving that form. What we call gravity is simply the balance between these two motions, where energy condenses into matter and then returns back into dispersion. I think that G equals mv squared is a unification theory in the following way. By Walter Russell's cosmogony, all phenomena is motion to and away from a system center, which is gravity as the one, the push to a center of a system to form mass, and the push away from a system center to dissipate mass, or gravity as the many, the push to the center of a system to form mass and radiation, as the many is the push from the center towards the periphery to dissipate mass. Therefore, gravity increases and decreases as G equals mv squared as a mass moves towards or away from its system center. All phenomena, according to Russell, are expressions of gravitation and radiation, and in that simple way, G equals mv squared unifies all phenomena as it expresses something that applies to all phenomena. Electromagnetic radiation consists of electric and magnetic energy fields that always exist together. In the Russell's terms, the electric flow is gravitation towards the center of a system to create mass, and the magnetic flow is radiation away from the center of mass towards the periphery to disintegrate mass. Both of these are gravity, or the complete life and death cycle of movement. Centripetal force characterizes every effect of gravitation. Centrifugal force characterizes every effect of radiation. Electricity is for the reason the attractive force and magnetism the repellent force. So you think of G equals mv squared not as a literal equation, but a symbolic way to describe a unifying process. Gravity is the balance of gravitation and radiation. Gravitation is the inward motion that organizes energy into mass, while radiation is the outward motion that dissolves mass back into energy. So what we call gravity is really this continuous cycle of inward formation and outward release. And in this sense, G equals mv squared represents how this cycle intensifies depending on how much mass is involved and how dynamically it is moving within its system. As mass moves towards the center, gravitation dominates and form increases. As it moves away, radiation dominates and form breaks down. All phenomena can then be understood as expressions of this two-way motion. What we see as electromagnetic behavior follows the same pattern. The electric aspect corresponds to inward organizing motion, and the magnetic aspect corresponds to outward dispersing motion. Together, they form a complete cycle, centripetal forces building structure and centrifugal forces releasing it, showing that everything is part of the same ongoing process of formation and dissolution. That may actually be why in occult chemistry, you always see the male and the female aspect of everything. Within a unified field interpretation, gravity may be reconsidered not as a simple inward pull, but as a manifestation of gravitation and radiation, understood as the centripetal phase of a dynamic vortex system. In this framing, what is commonly called gravity represents the convergent behavior of a central organizing principle within the ether itself, where matter appears to accrete toward nodal centers of energetic equilibrium. And in this model, gravitation and radiation are not separate forces, but they are complementary expressions of a single cyclical process. Gravitation corresponds to the phase of concentration, condensation, and integration, where energy appears to organize into mass and form. Radiation corresponds to the phase of dispersion, decomposition, and release, where structured mass returns to a more diffuse state. From this perspective, mass is not a static substance, but a temporarily stabilized configuration of energy, sustained by inwardly coherent ordering tendencies. Therefore, mass may be described as energy held in patterned inertia, while form is the perceptible outcome of this stabilization process. Energy is thereby understood as undergoing continuous transformations, conceived in inertial potential, structured into mass through convergence, and recorded as spatial temporal patterns. Within electromagnetic interpretation, electric and magnetic phenomena can be conceptually reframed as complementary directional expressions of the same cycle. Electric behavior may be interpreted as the convergent or organizing phase associated with masculinity structure toward a center of coherence, while magnetic behavior corresponds to femininity, the divergent or distributive phase associated with outward release and field expansion. And in this sense, centripetal and centrifugal dynamics become generalized descriptors of a universal oscillatory process governing all observable interactions. In such a unified field view, what is traditionally separated into gravity, electromagnetism, and inertia becomes integrated as a single cyclical field dynamic, one in which existence is continuously formed through convergence and continuously dissolved through divergence, maintaining equilibrium through these two perceptual motions of the underlying system. Now, the Michelson-Morley experiment was one of the earliest key moments that challenged how motion through a medium was being interpreted. Yet, instead of leading to a re-examination of a physical ether, it set the stage for new theoretical explanations. In 1905, Albert Einstein introduced special relativity, bringing the concept of time dilation into the picture as a way to address these results and preserve the heliocentric satanic vacuum model. The Jekyll Island meeting then marked a major moment in the consolidation of financial and institutional power, setting the stage for broader coordination between global systems of influence. Not long after, in 1913, Niels Bohr established the Bohrian model of the atom, creating a theoretical solar system at the subatomic level that mirrored the heliocentric structure. And that same year, the Sagnac experiment demonstrated results that could be interpreted as motion relative to a medium, but yet these findings were ultimately reframed within relativity interpretations rather than being used to support an ether. Moving forward to 1925, Samuel Gaudsmit and George Uhlenbeck co-developed the concept of electron spin, adding further theoretical complexity to the electrical behavior of matter and making the mechanics of the world less accessible and more abstract. That same year, Wolfgang Pauli introduced the exclusion principle, further complicating the atomic model with additional theoretical layers that moved focus away from simpler structural interpretations. Also in 1925, the Michelson-Gale experiment was conducted. And just like earlier experiments, the results were interpreted with relativity rather than as direct evidence of a physical medium. By the time of the Solvay conference in 1927, that famous picture that everyone knows, marked that this shift had reached a defining moment. What was presented as a major scientific breakthrough also functioned as a turning point where ether-based physics was set aside in favor of abstract theoretical models. The network of scientists worked to move science away from the idea of a tangible pressurized dielectric system and into a framework built on complex, often untestable mathematics. To address the lack of observed motion of the Earth, Max Born, a key developer of quantum mechanics, he helped shift the focus from predictable ether behavior to probability waves, making sure that the nature of energy became framed within mathematical uncertainty. At the same time, Paul Ehrenfest helped bridge classical thermodynamics with these newer abstract models, reinforcing the transition into a different way of understanding physical systems. This progression continued into 1938, when Lise Meitner contributed to the discovery of nuclear fission, redirecting the public's understanding of energy towards centralized, high-risk nuclear power systems rather than more naturally occurring and widely accessible free energy. Over time, these developments reinforced a model where energy became something that needed to be generated, distributed, and controlled through infrastructure. If a pervasive medium exists, energy could be understood as something naturally present and widely accessible. If only a vacuum is assumed, energy becomes something that must be dug up, mined for, produced, managed, and delivered. Taken together, these developments reflect a complete shift in how physics, energy, and the natural world became understood, moving from a tangible, medium-based perspective to a system dominated by abstraction and controlled interpretations. So when we step back and look at the bigger picture, what we call gravity isn't just a force pulling things together. It's part of a deeper cycle, a constant rhythm of energy moving inward to form and outward to dissolve. Everything we observe, mass, motion, electricity, magnetism, it's just an expression of this all-pervading ongoing process. Nothing is static. Everything is becoming. And within the framework that we've explored, this process unfolds through a continuous medium, what Dmitri Mendeleev and even Newton described as a real all-pervading ether. Not empty space, but a universal field where energy moves, accumulates, and reorganizes into form. When we look at models like Walter Russell's spiral graph system, where elements emerge from pre-hydrogen states like alphanon, betanon, gammanon, and ethanon, the ether particle as well, omni in occult ether physics, we start to see that hydrogen may not be the beginning, but a threshold, a point where the invisible becomes the visible, where the ether condenses into matter. Even Mendeleev's idea of ether atoms, the ultra-light, fast-moving units permeating all space, hints at something deeper, what later interpretations would call the aetherons, suggesting that this medium may not just be continuous, but structured, capable of motion, exchange, and transformation. Light, radiation, and energy itself may arise from the behavior of this ethereal medium, not from emptiness. And when you connect this to harmonic relationships, frequency, tone, vibration, and audio, you begin to see that elements are not isolated substances, but resonant states, patterns within a field, expressions of a single underlying reality. So gravity, energy, and matter, they're not separate systems. They are different forces of the same process, a dynamic equilibrium within a universal medium, the luminiferous ether.